Imagine this: an honorable military funeral, a grieving widow clutching a folded flag, and a four-star general standing at attention to pay his final respects. The air is heavy with sorrow, the silence sacred, until suddenly a gun is drawn. A racist cop, blinded by arrogance and prejudice, aims his weapon at the wrong man, a decorated war hero. The funeral turns into a battlefield, and in that single moment, Sergeant Douglas Harper seals his fate. Because what he doesn't know is that the man he just threatened is not just any soldier. He's one of the most powerful men in the U.S. military. And now, Harper's about to learn the hard way that power doesn't protect you from justice. This is the shocking, suspenseful, and downright jaw-dropping story of how a corrupt officer went from wielding a badge to wearing prison chains, sentenced to life for a crime he never saw coming. Buckle up, because this is a downfall you have to see to believe. The courtroom was silent, but the tension was unbearable. Every seat was filled, every eye locked onto the man standing in the defendant's box. The once proud police officer, Sergeant Douglas Harper, was now barely recognizable, his uniform replaced with an orange jumpsuit, his hands shackled in cold steel cuffs. The judge, an older man with piercing eyes and a commanding presence, leaned forward, his voice echoing through the silent room. "Sergeant Douglas Harper, you have been found guilty on all charges, including unlawful use of force, abuse of power, and attempted murder of a military officer. Given the severity of your crimes and your clear abuse of authority, this court has no choice but to impose the maximum sentence." A ripple of gasps filled the room. The cameras from major news networks zoomed in, capturing every second of what was about to happen. The judge's next words shattered whatever little hope Harper had left. "You are hereby sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole." A single cry rang out from the back of the room. Harper's mother, sobbing uncontrollably. Harper himself seemed frozen, his face drained of color. This wasn't supposed to happen. He was supposed to be the one in control, the one giving orders, the one holding the power. But now, the power was gone. The officers moved in to escort him out. But before they could, a deep, steady voice spoke from the front row. "You didn't think you'd ever face consequences, did you, Harper?" All eyes turned to the man speaking, General Nathaniel Carter. His gaze was unshaken, unbothered, just as it had been on the day Harper pointed a gun at his chest, thinking he could get away with it. That moment had changed everything. That moment was why Harper was standing here today, about to be locked away for the rest of his life. That moment was where it all began. Just days before, the Arlington National Cemetery was covered in a cold, heavy mist. The scent of damp earth filled the air as the sound of boots shuffling on wet grass broke the silence. Rows of uniformed soldiers stood in perfect formation, their medals shining dimly under the overcast sky. A grieving widow clutched a folded American flag, her hands trembling as silent tears ran down her face. General Nathaniel Carter stood at the front, his pristine dress uniform crisp against the solemn backdrop. His posture was rigid, his hands clasped behind his back, his dark aviator sunglasses hiding any trace of emotion. He had been through wars, had lost men under his command, but today was different. Today, he was burying a man he had personally mentored. Major William Daniels had been more than a soldier. He had been a brother in arms. But an IED had ripped that away, leaving only memories and a hole in the hearts of those who had served with him. The ceremony was reaching its final moments. The honor guard had fired the 21-gun salute. The last note of taps had faded into the wind. All that remained was the final farewell. Carter inhaled deeply, ready to take his last step forward and pay his respects. But then, "Get down, hands where I can see them." The sudden, sharp command cut through the air like a blade. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Heads snapped toward the source of the commotion. Two uniformed police officers stood at the edge of the funeral gathering, their guns drawn and aimed directly at General Carter. For a moment, silence hung in the air, thick and suffocating. The younger officer, a fresh-faced recruit, looked uncertain, his fingers twitching over his holster. The older one, Sergeant Douglas Harper, wore a hardened scowl. His stance was firm, his gun steady, his face twisted in pure, unshaken arrogance. Carter didn't move. Mourners stared in disbelief. Soldiers instinctively reached for their holsters before remembering. They had come unarmed. The widow let out a horrified sob. Carter's voice was calm, measured, the voice of a man who had commanded troops under enemy fire. "What do you think you're doing?" Harper stepped closer, his finger dangerously close to the trigger. "I said hands up now." The tension was unbearable. No one moved. No one even breathed. The only sound was the distant rustling of leaves, the soft shifting of boots on wet grass. Nathaniel Carter, a four-star general, a combat veteran, a war hero, stood unmoving. His chest rose and fell steadily, his broad shoulders squared as he locked eyes with the man threatening him. This wasn't just arrogance. This was something far more dangerous. It was bias. It was the belief that Harper had the power to do whatever he wanted, even if it meant holding a decorated black military officer at gunpoint in the middle of a funeral. Carter exhaled slowly, his voice even. "You're making a mistake?" Harper's lip curled. His grip on the gun tightened. "Oh yeah? And what mistake is that?" Carter tilted his head slightly. His voice was quiet, almost dangerous, the kind of quiet that ended careers. "You have no idea who you just pointed that gun at." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. The soldiers exchanged bewildered glances, their hands clenched at their sides. This wasn't some random civilian Harper was targeting. This was General Nathaniel Carter, one of the most respected military leaders in the country. Yet Harper's gun remained fixed on him, as if he were nothing more than a common criminal. A slow, heavy silence fell over the cemetery. Then, Sergeant Harper, a sharp voice cut through the air. It was Colonel Davis, a high-ranking officer among the honor guard. She stepped forward, her uniform decorated with ribbons and medals that demanded respect. "Do you realize you're pointing your weapon at a four-star general?" Harper scoffed, shaking his head. Colonel Davis didn't blink. She simply lifted her gloved hand and pointed at Carter's shoulders. At the four shining silver stars. The weight of the moment crashed down like a hammer. A stunned, strangled noise left Harper's throat. His trigger finger twitched. His knuckles went white. He blinked, as if seeing Carter for the first time. A four-star general, one of the highest-ranking officers in the United States Army. And Harper had just aimed a loaded weapon at his chest. The color drained from his face. He took a step back. His gun trembled in his hands. His mouth opened as if to speak, but no words came out. Carter remained still, his face unreadable, his presence unwavering. The silence stretched on. "Then, I could have you court-martialed," Carter said simply. Harper stiffened. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. The honor guard, the soldiers, the mourners, all of them stood in stunned disbelief. And Harper? Harper was just starting to realize his career, his reputation, his very freedom were all hanging by a thread, and the thread was about to snap. Harper's breath quickened. His grip on the gun was slipping, his fingers slick with sweat. He could feel every single pair of eyes locked onto him, drilling into his skin, watching his career crumble in real time. But it wasn't just his career that was at risk. It was his freedom. Carter's gaze remained unwavering. He took a slow step forward, his presence commanding, unshaken by the weapon still pointed at him. "You have no idea," Carter said, his voice low and calm, "how badly you've miscalculated." Harper's jaw tensed. His lips parted as if to respond, but nothing came out. He was trapped. He could feel it. The weight of the mistake pressed against his chest, squeezing the air from his lungs. Then, "Sergeant," the voice came from beside him. Officer Bradley, the young cop who had been silent all this time, finally found his voice. His blue eyes were wide with horror, his hands trembling at his sides. "Lower your weapon," Bradley said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Now!" Harper whipped his head toward the rookie, disbelief twisting his face. "What did you just say?" "I said put the gun down," Bradley repeated, firmer this time. His throat bobbed as he swallowed. This isn't right." Harper stared at him, furious, but Bradley wasn't looking at him anymore. His eyes were on Carter, on the soldiers, on the casket of Major Daniels, still resting in front of them. The folded flag clutched in the widow's shaking hands. This was a funeral, and Harper had turned it into a crime scene. The weight of that realization seemed to crash down on the young officer. His hands twitched near his holster, but he didn't reach for it. "Sergeant," Bradley said again, quieter now. "Please." For a moment, just a brief moment, Harper considered listening. But then his pride, his arrogance, took hold again. His grip tightened on the gun. "No," Harper growled. His voice shook. "No, I'm not the bad guy here. You don't get it, Bradley. This is how it works. You see something suspicious, you act. You don't ask questions." Carter tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "And tell me," Carter said, his voice like a blade slicing through the air. "What exactly was suspicious about me, Sergeant?" Harper's throat went dry. He had no answer, but he didn't need to say it. Everyone already knew. Carter had been standing at the front of the funeral, mourning a fallen soldier. He had been doing nothing wrong, and yet Harper had immediately assumed the worst. Because of the color of his skin. Because in Harper's mind, a man like Carter didn't belong at the front of a military funeral, no matter how many stars were on his uniform. The silence that followed was deafening. Then, Sergeant Douglas Harper. The voice was firm, commanding. It belonged to Colonel Davis. Harper turned his head slightly, his jaw clenching. "This is your last chance," Davis continued, stepping forward. "Lower your weapon. Now." Harper didn't move. His mind raced. He had gone too far. He knew that. But he couldn't back down now. Could he? He had built his entire career on control, on power, on the belief that his badge made him untouchable. If he lowered his gun now, if he admitted he was wrong, then everything he had ever believed about himself, about the authority he thought he had, would crumble. So instead of complying, Harper did the one thing no one expected. He took a step forward and cocked his gun. A stunned gasp rippled through the crowd. Carter didn't even blink. "You really don't know when to quit, do you?" Carter said quietly. Harper's nostrils flared. His pulse pounded in his ears. His hands trembled, but he held the gun steady. "You're under arrest," Harper growled, desperation seeping into his voice. "For what?" Carter asked. His tone was almost amused now. Harper had no answer. His vision blurred. His head spun, and that was when it hit him. He had lost. The realization shattered whatever little control he had left. Harper opened his mouth to say something. Anything. But before he could, there was movement from the corner of his eye. Then, a deafening click. The unmistakable sound of a dozen holsters snapping open in unison. Harper stiffened. It took him less than a second to realize what had happened. The honor guard. The decorated soldiers. The men and women who had fought wars under Carter's command. They had armed themselves. And now, every single one of them had their weapons trained on him. Bradley took a step away from Harper, his hands raised slightly. The silence stretched. Harper's heart pounded in his chest. His fingers twitched over the trigger. And then, a single, deadly voice broke through the tension. "Drop it," Carter said. Harper's entire body locked up. His arms trembled. His knees weakened. But still he hesitated. "Sergeant Harper," Colonel Davis said, her voice razor-sharp. "This is not a request." Harper's breath was ragged now. His mind screamed at him to do something, to take control of the situation. But there was no control left. Not for him. And so, finally, with shaking hands, Sergeant Douglas Harper let the gun slip from his grasp. The weapon hit the ground with a soft thud. And the moment it did, two military police officers stepped forward. In a matter of seconds, Harper found himself being shoved forward, his arms wrenched behind his back. Click! The cold bite of steel cuffs snapped around his wrists. It was over. For the first time since drawing his weapon, Harper finally seemed to understand the gravity of what he had done. His career was over. His authority was gone. And as the MP tightened their grip on his arms and began marching him toward the waiting patrol car, his freedom was slipping away too. The crowd watched in stunned silence as Harper was dragged off the funeral grounds. Officer Bradley, still standing frozen near Carter, swallowed hard. He looked at the general, as if searching for guidance, for reassurance that what had just happened was real. Carter didn't speak. He simply turned back to the casket of Major Daniels, exhaling deeply. The widow still clutched the folded flag, silent tears streaming down her face. And just like that, the funeral resumed, because Harper had tried to strip this moment of its dignity. But Carter refused to let him win. Somewhere beyond the cemetery gates, Harper sat in the back of the squad car, his wrists cuffed, his mind racing. He wasn't just losing his job. He was about to lose everything. And deep down, he knew this was only the beginning. The prison gates loomed ahead like the jaws of a beast waiting to devour its prey. Sergeant Douglas Harper sat in the back of the armored police transport, his wrists bound in heavy-duty shackles. His orange jumpsuit, stiff and unfamiliar, scratched against his skin. The air inside the vehicle was thick with the scent of sweat and cold metal. This wasn't supposed to happen. Not to him. Not to a cop. Harper's hands trembled slightly in his lap, though he refused to acknowledge the fear bubbling in his chest. His entire life, his career, his authority, his reputation, had all come crashing down in a single moment of arrogance. He had thought he was invincible. He had believed his badge made him untouchable. Now, the only thing that awaited him was a cell. The officer sitting across from him, a burly, expressionless man with a buzz cut, glanced down at the file in his hands and scoffed. "You really messed up, Harper," the officer said flatly. "You pointed a gun at a four-star general? At a funeral?" Harper didn't answer. He just stared ahead, jaw clenched, muscles tight. "You're lucky they didn't shoot you on the spot," the officer continued, shaking his head. "But I guess luck doesn't mean much anymore, does it?" Harper exhaled through his nose, refusing to speak. The officer smirked. "You know what the worst part is?" he mused, flipping through the paperwork. "This ain't some slap on the wrist. This ain't some temporary leave. You're done, Harper. Life in prison. No badge. No gun. No power. Just another inmate in an orange suit, same as the ones you used to lock up." That last part stung more than Harper cared to admit. He was no longer Sergeant Harper. He was just another prisoner now. The transport vehicle rumbled forward, its tires crunching against the gravel as it pulled up to the massive steel gates of Redwood Federal Penitentiary, a maximum security prison, the kind of place reserved for the worst of the worst. Harper's stomach twisted. He had spent years throwing people behind bars, telling himself they deserved it. But now he was one of them. The doors of the transport swung open with a metallic groan. "On your feet," the officer ordered. Harper hesitated for half a second before stepping out. The moment his feet hit the pavement, two guards grabbed his arms, their grips iron tight. They wasted no time in hauling him toward the entrance, through the towering steel doors, into the prison he would never leave. The second he stepped inside, a wave of noise hit him. Shouting, metal clanking, the distant echo of men laughing, some deep, some chilling. The kind of laughter that sent a shiver up Harper's spine. The guards marched him forward, past rows of cells where inmates pressed their faces against the bars. Some jeered. Others watched in eerie silence. Then one voice rang out above the rest. Well. Harper turned his head, just slightly, just enough to see where the voice was coming from. A man stood behind the bars of a cell, arms crossed over his broad chest, a smirk tugging at his lips. Harper recognized him instantly. Malik Carter, a gang leader, a convicted murderer, a man Harper had personally arrested years ago. Malik's eyes gleamed with amusement as he stared at Harper, taking in the sight of the once proud officer now dressed in the same jumpsuit as the criminals he used to lock away. "Look at you," Malik chuckled. "Didn't think I'd see this day, man. Ain't it funny how life works?" Harper's fist clenched, but he said nothing. Malik leaned against the bars, shaking his head in mock pity. "You put a lot of guys away, Harper. A lot of guys. You think they forgot?" A few other inmates chuckled darkly from nearby cells. Harper's blood turned ice cold. "You're in here now," Malik continued, flashing a slow, dangerous grin. "Ain't no badge to hide behind, no backup, no gun. Just you." The guards didn't stop walking. They pulled Harper forward, down the hall, toward the processing room. But Harper could still hear the laughter following him. His own words, the ones he had thrown at so many men over the years, came back to haunt him. "You made your choices. Now you live with them. Hours later, Harper sat in his cell. Alone. Silent. The reality of his situation was beginning to settle in. His trial had been swift. The evidence had been overwhelming. General Nathaniel Carter's testimony alone had sealed Harper's fate. The footage from the funeral. The statements from the honor guard. The cold, irrefutable proof that Harper had drawn his weapon on an innocent man, on a decorated general, out of sheer arrogance and racism. There had been no way out. His final moment in the courtroom replayed in his mind like a broken record. The judge's voice. Life in prison. The gasps in the courtroom. His mother's cry. And then Carter's voice. You didn't think you'd ever face consequences, did you? Harper squeezed his eyes shut. He had always been the one in control. Always the one calling the shots. But now he was nothing. A prisoner. A criminal. And the worst part? This was just the beginning. Because outside his cell, in the dark hallways of Redwood Federal Penitentiary, men were waiting for him. Men who had waited a long time for the day Douglas Harper would finally be behind bars. And they were ready. Harper sat motionless on the stiff mattress of his prison cot, his hands resting on his knees, his mind a whirlwind of panic and disbelief. The walls of his cell felt like they were closing in on him, suffocating him with the weight of his own actions. Life in prison. The words echoed in his head over and over, a cruel reminder that there was no way out. No appeals. No second chances. This was it. He could hear the murmurs from the other inmates. The whispers carried through the air like a storm brewing in the distance. They knew who he was. They knew what he had done. And worst of all, they remembered exactly what kind of cop he had been. A heavy clang shattered the silence. The cell door buzzed, then slid open. On your feet, Harper, a guard ordered. Harper hesitated, but the guard stepped forward, grabbing his arm and yanking him to his feet. Let's go, the guard said. Time for your introduction. Harper frowned. Introduction? The guard smirked. You'll see. The halls were dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of sweat and old metal. Harper kept his head low as the guards led him down the cell block. He could feel the eyes on him. Every step he took, every corner he rounded, more inmates turned to watch. Some whispered to each other. Others grinned. A few simply stared, their expressions unreadable. Then came the voices. Well, if it ain't the cop. Didn't think you'd end up in here. Huh, Harper's? Guess the badge don't mean nothing now, does it? Laughter followed. Low, taunting, full of something dangerous. Harper clenched his jaw, keeping his eyes forward. He refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing him react. But then, a voice cut through the noise. A voice Harper knew. You look a little nervous, officer. Harper's head snapped toward the direction of the voice. Standing at the edge of the common area, arms crossed over his chest, was Malik Carter. Not General Carter. This Carter was someone else entirely. A gang leader. A ruthless, violent man Harper had put away years ago. And now, Malik had Harper right where he wanted him. The inmates around Malik chuckled, their eyes flickering with anticipation. Harper swallowed hard. The guards didn't stop walking. They led Harper straight through the common area, forcing him to walk past Malik and his crew. Got real quiet all of a sudden, Malik mused, tilting his head. That ain't like you, Harper. Harper kept walking. Come on, man, Malik taunted. You used to love talking. You had plenty to say back when you were tossing people in cells. What happened? The other inmates laughed. Harper's fists clenched at his sides. He wouldn't give them a reaction. He couldn't, because showing fear here was like spilling blood in shark-infested water. Let him go, one of the guards muttered under his breath as they led Harper past Malik. He's already dead anyway. Harper stiffened at those words. Already dead? His heart pounded against his ribs. No. He wasn't going to be some easy target. He was not going to be hunted in this place. But then, just as he thought he was safe, a sharp, sudden crash echoed through the room. Before Harper could react, something slammed into the side of his face. Pain exploded through his skull as he stumbled backward, barely managing to stay on his feet. Then, the room erupted. A dozen inmates lunged forward, fists flying. The guards barely had time to react before chaos broke loose. Harper raised his arms instinctively, trying to block the onslaught, but it was no use. A punch landed against his ribs. Another cracked against his jaw. His vision blurred. The world tilted. Then, the cold, hard floor rushed up to meet him. He tasted blood. His own. And just before everything went black, he heard Malik's voice, low and mocking. "Welcome to our world, officer." Then, darkness. Pain. That was the first thing Harper felt when he woke up. It crept through his skull, wrapped around his ribs, settled deep in his muscles like an unbearable weight. He tried to move, but even the smallest shift sent a fresh wave of agony through his body. He forced his eyes open. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The room smelled of antiseptic and metal. A hospital wing. For a brief moment, relief washed over him. He was still alive, but that relief was short-lived, because when he turned his head, he saw a man standing at the foot of his bed. A man dressed in a crisp military uniform. A man who had every reason to want him right where he was. General Nathaniel Carter. Harper froze. Carter's face was unreadable. He watched Harper for a long, silent moment before finally speaking. "I warned you," Carter said. His voice was calm, steady, unshaken. Harper's mouth felt dry. Carter exhaled, shaking his head slightly. "You thought you were invincible. You thought you could do whatever you wanted, treat people however you wanted, and never face the consequences." He took a slow step forward, his boots clicking against the tile floor. "Well, Harper," Carter continued, his voice dropping lower, "how does it feel to finally be powerless?" Harper swallowed hard. He wanted to speak. He wanted to argue. But he couldn't, because for the first time in his life, Nathaniel Carter was right. Harper tried to sit up, but pain shot through his ribs, forcing him to collapse back onto the stiff hospital bed with a grunt. His body felt like it had been through a meat grinder. General Nathaniel Carter remained still, his sharp eyes locked on a Harper like a predator sizing up its wounded prey. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across his face, making his unreadable expression even more intimidating. Harper swallowed, his throat dry as sandpaper. "What?" His voice came out hoarse. He coughed, forcing himself to try again. "What do you want?" Carter exhaled slowly, his arms crossed over his chest. "You really think you're in a position to ask questions?" Harper clenched his jaw. The hospital sheets felt suffocating. He had spent years giving orders, demanding answers, controlling situations. But now he had nothing. Carter took another step closer. "You had everything," Carter said, his voice low and even. "A career, a future, a life outside these walls. And you threw it all away." Harper turned his head away, staring at the wall. "I didn't." "You did." Harper flinched at the force behind those words. Carter wasn't yelling. "You didn't need to. You let your arrogance, your entitlement, and your hate put you in this bed," Carter continued. "You thought your badge made you untouchable." Harper forced himself to look at him. "I wasn't trying to save it," Carter interrupted, his voice ice cold. "I've heard every excuse man like you have to offer. It was a mistake. I was just doing my job. I didn't mean it that way." Harper swallowed hard. Carter leaned in slightly. "You pointed a gun at me. At a 4-star general. At a military funeral. In front of hundreds of witnesses. And the worst part? You didn't even hesitate." Harper's chest tightened. He had convinced himself that it was just instinct, that he had reacted the way any cop would. But deep down, he knew the truth. He had seen a black man at the front of a funeral, and he had assumed. That assumption had cost him everything. Carter took a slow breath, then straightened. "You should have been locked up a long time ago." Harper's eyes snapped up. But Carter was already turning to leave. And that's when Harper panicked. "Wait." Carter paused, his back still to Harper. The words tumbled out before Harper could stop them. "They're going to kill me in here." Silence. Harper's heart pounded. He had never begged for help before. But this was different. "You saw what happened in the yard," Harper continued, his voice shaking slightly. "They almost killed me." Carter turned his head just slightly, just enough for Harper to see the ghost of a smirk on his face. "Good." Harper's stomach dropped. Carter took a step toward the door. "You put away a lot of men, Harper. A lot of men who remember you." He glanced over his shoulder. "Let's see how long you last." Then he walked out. and Harper was left alone, left to the cold realization that there was no one left to protect him. Not his badge, not his authority, not even the system he had once sworn to uphold. And for the first time in his life, Harper felt true fear. The next few days blurred together in a haze of paranoia. Harper could barely sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he felt it, the weight of the stairs. He knew the inmates were watching him, waiting. The attack in the common area had been a warning, a message. They weren't done with him yet. He kept his head low, avoiding eye contact as he moved through the prison. But it didn't matter. The whispers followed him everywhere. Look at him. Scared now? This the same guy who used to lock us up? Man, ain't so tough anymore. But he don't last a month. Harper ignored them, or at least he tried to. But then, one night, as he was returning to his cell, it happened. The guards were distracted, their attention focused elsewhere. And in that brief moment, a hand shot out from the shadows, grabbing Harper by the collar and yanking him backward. Harper's back slammed against the cold concrete wall, his breath knocked from his lungs. Then, a blade pressed against his throat. His pulse froze. The man holding him was huge, a towering, heavily muscled inmate with cold, dead eyes. "You're a long way from home, officer," the man whispered, his breath hot against Harper's skin. Harper's mind raced. "Listen," he rasped, trying to keep his voice steady. "You don't want to do this?" The man chuckled darkly. "Nah," he said. "I really do." The blade pressed harder. Harper's body went rigid. He was going to die. Right here. Right now. Then, a voice. "Back off." The pressure against Harper's throat eased slightly. The massive inmate turned his head just enough to see who had spoken. Harper looked too, and his blood ran cold. It was Malik Carter. Malik stood just a few feet away, arms crossed, watching the scene unfold with a neutral expression. The massive inmate sneered. "This ain't your business, Carter." Malik raised an eyebrow. "You sure about that?" A tense silence stretched between them. Then, the blade disappeared. The massive inmate stepped back, giving Harper one last glare before muttering under his breath and disappearing into the darkness. Harper collapsed against the wall, sucking in a ragged breath. He looked up at Malik, confused. "Why?" He started, his voice still shaky. "Why did you stop him?" Malik smirked. "Who said I stopped him for you?" Harper's stomach twisted. Malik took a slow step closer, leaning in just slightly. "You don't get it, do you?" he murmured. "You're not safe here, Harper. And you never will be." Harper swallowed hard. Malik tilted his head. "You will suffer. You will pay for what you've done." His smirk widened slightly. "But not yet." A chill ran down Harper's spine. Then, Malik turned and walked away, leaving Harper alone in the dimly lit hallway. The message was clear. They weren't going to kill him. Not yet, because Malik Carter had something far worse planned. And for the first time, Harper realized death would have been a mercy. Harper sat on the edge of his cot, his body stiff, his mind a battlefield of fear and paranoia. The faint hum of the prison echoed around him, distant footsteps, hushed murmurs, the occasional clang of metal doors slamming shut. But nothing was louder than the silence in his own head. The silence of waiting. The silence of knowing something was coming. Malik Carter hadn't saved him out of kindness. He hadn't done it out of mercy. No. Malik had kept him alive because he wanted to break him first. Harper knew what that meant, and he knew he couldn't stop it. Days passed. The guards treated him like any other prisoner, indifferent, detached. They weren't going to protect him. The inmates? They watched him, waited. They whispered things when they passed his cell. "Dead man walking. Not today, but soon. Hope you ain't scared of the dark, Harper." Harper tried to ignore them, tried to focus on surviving. But then, one night, the lights went out. Not just in his cell. The entire block. Pitch black. Total silence. Harper's heartbeat slammed against his ribs. He sat up, his eyes darting through the darkness. He could hear movement. Footsteps. Quiet. Calculated. Then, his door creaked open. A shadow moved inside. Harper barely had time to react before hands grabbed him. A rough fist crashed against his jaw, snapping his head sideways. He groaned, struggling, but they were too many. They pulled him from his cot, slamming him to the floor. A foot pressed against his back. Another hand grabbed his wrist, yanking it backward at a painful angle. Then, a voice. Low, calm, deadly. Harper. The pressure against his back lifted slightly. The hands gripping him loosened. The men stepped aside, and standing above him, looking down with that same unreadable smirk, was Malik Carter. Harper coughed, his head spinning. His ribs ached from the impact. Malik crouched beside him, resting his elbows on his knees. "You getting comfortable yet?" Malik asked, his voice almost amused. Harper spat blood onto the floor, glaring up at him. "What do you want?" he rasped. Malik chuckled. "What do I want?" He glanced around at the other inmates, shaking his head. "Nah, Harper. This ain't about me." Harper narrowed his eyes. Malik leaned in slightly. "This is about justice." Harper's stomach twisted. Malik exhaled, cracking his knuckles. "You spent your whole life making people feel powerless, didn't you?" His smirk faded. "Well, now it's your turn." Harper swallowed hard. "You see," Malik continued, tapping his fingers against his knee, "I could have let them kill you that first night. But where's the fun in that?" He let the words settle. Let Harper feel them. Then he spoke again. "I don't want you dead, Harper." Harper frowned. "Then what?" Malik cut him off. "I want you to wish you were." A shiver ran down Harper's spine. Malik stood up, giving a small nod to the men standing around them. "Take him," he ordered. Before Harper could react, something crashed against the side of his head. Pain exploded through his skull. The world spun. Then, darkness. When Harper woke up, his wrists were bound, his ankles tied together, a gag stuffed in his mouth. And worst of all, he was no longer in his cell. His heart slammed against his chest as he looked around. He was in a different part of the prison, somewhere dark, somewhere isolated, somewhere no one would hear him scream. A single light bulb flickered above him. The air was damp. Then, footsteps. Harper's breath caught in his throat. Malik Carter stepped into the light, his face unreadable. "Welcome to your new home, Harper," he said. Harper struggled against the restraints, his breathing frantic. Malik chuckled. "Don't bother," he said. "No one's coming for you." Harper's muffled screams filled the air, but Malik didn't flinch. He just smiled. Because Harper wasn't going to die today. No, that would be too easy. Malik had plans for him, and Harper was just beginning to understand. This was going to be worse than death. Harper's breaths came in frantic gasps. His body trembled, sweat trickling down his temple as he struggled against the restraints binding his wrists and ankles. The rope burned against his skin, but it wouldn't budge. Malik Carter stood before him, arms crossed, his smirk unwavering. The dim, flickering light bulb above them cast eerie shadows across the damp concrete walls. "Scared, Harper?" Malik asked, tilting his head. Harper glared, his chest rising and falling with panicked breaths. He tried to speak, but the rag stuffed in his mouth muffled his words. Malik sighed, crouching beside him. "Man, I remember when you had all the power. Back when you were throwing people like me in cages, treating us like animals." He paused, looking Harper dead in the eyes. "Funny how the tables turn, huh?" Harper let out a muffled growl, thrashing against the restraints. Malik chuckled. "You keep fighting like that, and you're going to wear yourself out before we even get started." Harper froze. His stomach twisted. "Before we even get started." The words sent a new wave of terror through his veins. Malik stood up and gestured toward the shadows. Two men stepped forward. Both inmates, their faces unreadable. One carried a metal bucket. The other held a long, dirty cloth. Harper's breath hitched. Malik's smirk widened. "You know what this is, don't you?" Malik asked, nodding toward the bucket. Harper knew. He had seen the reports, the leaked footage, the stories of enhanced interrogation techniques used on suspected criminals. And now, he was about to be on the receiving end. The two inmates grabbed him, yanking him up from the floor. His body ached from the previous beating, but they didn't care. They forced him onto his back, securing him to a metal bench bolted to the floor. Malik leaned over him, his expression unreadable. "Relax," he said. "We ain't gonna kill you. We just want to give you a little taste of what you did to us." Harper thrashed, his heart slamming against his ribs. He tried to scream, but the cloth was shoved over his face before he could. Then, the water poured, cold, suffocating, unrelenting. Harper's body went rigid as the water soaked the cloth, filling his nose, his mouth, drowning him in an instant. His lungs screamed for air. His body convulsed, desperate to break free, but the hands holding him down were stronger. He wasn't dying, but he felt like he was. Seconds stretched into eternity. Just when he thought he couldn't take another second, the water stopped. Harper coughed violently, his body jerking as he gasped for breath. His vision swam, his chest heaving, his lungs burning. Malik crouched beside him again, watching. "You feel that?" he asked quietly. Harper couldn't respond. He was too busy trying to force air back into his lungs. "That's fear," Malik continued. "That's what you made us feel every time you abused your badge. Every time you pulled a gun on someone who didn't deserve it. Every time you used your power to hurt instead of protect." Harper wheezed, blinking water from his eyes. Malik sighed. "But hey, we ain't done yet." Harper barely had time to react before the water came again. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Harper couldn't tell anymore. His body was shaking, his throat raw from silent screams. His wrists ached from pulling against the restraints, his lungs burned from the constant drowning sensation. He lay there limp, his body refusing to fight anymore. Malik crouched beside him one last time. "See, Harper," he said, his tone almost conversational. "I could do this all day. I could make your life a living hell until you beg for death. But," he stood up, dusting off his hands, "I think it's more fun to let you live with it." Harper barely processed the words. His mind was swimming, his body wrecked. Malik leaned down, close enough for Harper to hear him clearly. "This ain't over," he whispered. This was just lesson one. Then, darkness. Harper woke up back in his cell. Alone. The first thing he felt was pain. Every inch of his body ached. His throat felt raw. His wrists throbbed. His breathing was slow, heavy. He didn't know how long he had been unconscious. But he knew one thing for sure. Malik Carter wasn't finished with him. Not even close. And the worst part? No one was coming to save him. He was truly, completely alone. And in Redwood Federal Penitentiary. That was the worst thing a man could be. Harper sat curled up in the corner of his cell, his knees drawn to his chest, his breathing slow and uneven. His body still ached from the torture Malik and his men had put him through. His wrists were raw from the restraints, his throat burned from gasping for air that never came. But the worst part wasn't the pain. It was the waiting. Malik had made it clear this wasn't over. And Harper had no idea when the next round would come. The hours passed like molasses, each second stretching out longer than the last. Every creak of a door, every approaching footstep sent a chill down his spine. Would it be another beating? Another round of waterboarding? Or would they finally decide to kill him? He didn't know. And not knowing was the worst punishment of all. The first sign that something was wrong came during chow time. Harper moved through the cafeteria like a ghost, his tray held tightly in his shaking hands. He kept his head low, trying not to draw attention to himself. He had learned his lesson, but Redwood had a way of reminding you. You never stop being a target. As he slid onto the end of a long metal bench, he could feel the eyes on him. Watching, waiting. Then, a voice from across the table. "You don't belong here." Harper looked up. The man sitting across from him was Leon Vargas, a heavily tattooed gang leader. A man Harper had put behind bars years ago. A man with every reason to hate him. Harper swallowed. "I'm just trying to eat." Vargas smirked. "That's cute," he said. "You think you get to decide that?" The men sitting next to Vargas chuckled darkly. Harper's pulse quickened. He was trapped. Vargas leaned forward, placing his elbows on the table. "You got a lot of enemies in here, Harper. People been waiting a long time to see you suffer." Harper clenched his jaw. "I don't want any trouble." Vargas grinned. "See, that's the problem." His fingers tapped against the metal table. "The trouble wants you." Harper's breath caught. Then, a sharp pain shot through his side. His tray clattered to the floor as his body seized up. His hands flew to his ribs, and when he looked down, blood. A shank. Someone had stabbed him. A second strike came before he could react, slicing across his forearm. Harper fell from the bench, hitting the cold tile floor hard. The cafeteria erupted. Guards yelled. Inmates scrambled. Fists flew. Harper tried to crawl away, but a boot slammed down on his hand, pinning him in place. Vargas crouched beside him, his voice low and amused. "That's just a warning," he murmured. "Next time, we go for the throat." Then, a whistle. Vargas and his men scattered just as the guards arrived. Harper gasped for breath, his vision swimming. The last thing he saw before he blacked out was the look on Malik Carter's face. Not surprise, not anger, just a slow, knowing smile. Harper woke up in the infirmary. Again, the sharp scent of antiseptic burned his nose. His ribs ached with every breath. A tight bandage wrapped around his midsection where the shank had sliced into him. For a moment, he just lay there, his mind spinning. Vargas had attacked him, but Malik hadn't stopped it. Why? Then, the door opened. Harper turned his head, his body tensing. A prison guard stepped inside, his expression unreadable. He held a small envelope in his hand. Harper frowned. "What's that?" The guard didn't answer. He simply tossed the envelope onto Harper's chest and walked out. Harper swallowed hard. With shaky fingers, he tore it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper. 4 words. "See you tomorrow. MC." Harper's stomach dropped. Malik had let Vargas attack him, because Malik wasn't done with him yet. This was just the beginning. And tomorrow? Tomorrow, it would be worse. Harper lay in the infirmary bed, his breathing shallow, his mind racing. The bandages wrapped tightly around his ribs did little to ease the sharp pain that pulsed with every movement. But the pain in his body wasn't the worst part. It was the note. "See you tomorrow. MC." For simple words. For words that meant this nightmare wasn't over. Malik Carter wasn't finished with him. And tomorrow could be his last day alive. Morning came too soon. Harper barely slept. Every time his eyes closed, he saw the cafeteria again. The shank, the blood, the cold, amused smirk on Malik's face as Vargas stabbed him twice without hesitation. The warning. Next time, we go for the throat. Now, Harper sat upright in the infirmary bed, his arms wrapped around his ribs, trying to steady his breathing. The door buzzed open. A guard stepped in. "Time's up, Harper." Harper's stomach twisted. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice hoarse. The guard smirked. "You think you get special treatment? You're going back to the block." Harper's heart pounded. "No," he blurted. I'm not ready. I need more time to recover." The guard chuckled. "Not how this works, cop." 2 more guards entered, grabbing Harper by the arms. He struggled, but the pain in his ribs made it impossible to fight back. They hauled him out of the infirmary and back into hell. The cell block was louder than usual. Harper's skin crawled as dozens of inmates turned to watch him being dragged back. Some smirked. Others whispered. A few just stared, their expressions hungry. Hungry for revenge. The guards threw Harper into his cell, slamming the door behind him. He barely had time to catch his breath before a shadow appeared in the doorway. Malik Carter. Harper's body went rigid. Malik leaned against the bars, watching him for a long moment. Then, he held up his hand. Harper coughed violently, his body jerking as he gasped for breath. His vision swam, his chest heaving, his lungs burning. Malik crouched beside him again, watching. "You feel that?" he asked quietly. Harper couldn't respond. He was too busy trying to force air back into his lungs. "That's fear," Malik continued. "That's what you made us feel every time you abused your badge. Every time you pulled a gun on someone who didn't deserve it. Every time you used your power to hurt instead of protect." Harper wheezed, blinking water from his eyes. Malik sighed. "But hey, we ain't done yet." Harper barely had time to react before the water came again. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Harper couldn't tell anymore. His body was shaking, his throat raw from silent screams. His wrists ached from pulling against the restraints, his lungs burned from the constant drowning sensation. He lay there limp, his body refusing to fight anymore. Malik crouched beside him one last time. "See, Harper," he said, his tone almost conversational. "I could do this all day. I could make your life a living hell until you beg for death. But," he stood up, dusting off his hands, I think it's more fun to let you live with it. Harper barely processed the words. His mind was swimming, his body wrecked. Malik leaned down, close enough for Harper to hear him clearly. This ain't over, he whispered. This? This was just lesson one. Then, darkness. Harper woke up back in his cell. Alone. The first thing he felt was pain. Every inch of his body ached. His throat felt raw. His wrists throbbed. His breathing was slow, heavy. He didn't know how long he had been unconscious. But he knew one thing for sure. Malik Carter wasn't finished with him. Not even close. And the worst part? No one was coming to save him. He was truly, completely alone. And in Redwood Federal Penitentiary. That was the worst thing a man could be. Harper sat curled up in the corner of his cell, his knees drawn to his chest, his breathing slow and uneven. His body still ached from the torture Malik and his men had put him through. His wrists were raw from the restraints, his throat burned from gasping for air that never came. But the worst part wasn't the pain. It was the waiting. Malik had made it clear this wasn't over. And Harper had no idea when the next round would come. The hours passed like molasses, each second stretching out longer than the last. Every creak of a door, every approaching footstep sent a chill down his spine. Would it be another beating? Another round of waterboarding? Or would they finally decide to kill him? He didn't know. And not knowing was the worst punishment of all. The first sign that something was wrong came during chow time. Harper moved through the cafeteria like a ghost, his tray held tightly in his shaking hands. He kept his head low, trying not to draw attention to himself. He had learned his lesson, but Redwood had a way of reminding you. You never stop being a target. As he slid onto the end of a long metal bench, he could feel the eyes on him. Watching, waiting. Then, a voice from across the table. You don't belong here. Harper looked up. The man sitting across from him was Leon Vargas, a heavily tattooed gang leader. A man Harper had put behind bars years ago. A man with every reason to hate him. Harper swallowed. I'm just trying to eat. Vargas smirked. That's cute, he said. You think you get to decide that? The men sitting next to Vargas chuckled darkly. Harper's pulse quickened. He was trapped. Vargas leaned forward, placing his elbows on the table. You got a lot of enemies in here, Harper. People been waiting a long time to see you suffer. Harper clenched his jaw. I don't want any trouble. Vargas grinned. See, that's the problem. His fingers tapped against the metal table. The trouble wants you. Harper's breath caught. Then, a sharp pain shot through his side. His tray clattered to the floor as his body seized up. His hands flew to his ribs, and when he looked down, blood. A shank. Someone had stabbed him. A second strike came before he could react, slicing across his forearm. Harper fell from the bench, hitting the cold tile floor hard. The cafeteria erupted. Guards yelled. Inmates scrambled. Fists flew. Harper tried to crawl away, but a boot slammed down on his hand, pinning him in place. Vargas crouched beside him, his voice low and amused. That's just a warning, he murmured. Next time, we go for the throat. Then, a whistle. Vargas and his men scattered just as the guards arrived. Harper gasped for breath, his vision swimming. The last thing he saw before he blacked out was the look on Malik Carter's face. Not surprise, not anger, just a slow, knowing smile. Harper woke up in the infirmary. Again, the sharp scent of antiseptic burned his nose. His ribs ached with every breath. A tight bandage wrapped around his midsection where the shank had sliced into him. For a moment, he just lay there, his mind spinning. Vargas had attacked him, but Malik hadn't stopped it. Why? Then, the door opened. Harper turned his head, his body tensing. A prison guard stepped inside, his expression unreadable. He held a small envelope in his hand. Harper frowned. What's that? The guard didn't answer. He simply tossed the envelope onto Harper's chest and walked out. Harper swallowed hard. With shaky fingers, he tore it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper. 4 words. See you tomorrow. MC. Harper's stomach dropped. Malik had let Vargas attack him. Because Malik wasn't done with him yet. This was just the beginning. And tomorrow? Tomorrow, it would be worse. Harper lay in the infirmary bed, his breathing shallow, his mind racing. The bandages wrapped tightly around his ribs did little to ease the sharp pain that pulsed with every movement. But the pain in his body wasn't the worst part. It was the note. See you tomorrow. MC. For simple words. For words that meant this nightmare wasn't over. Malik Carter wasn't finished with him. And tomorrow could be his last day alive. Morning came too soon. Harper barely slept. Every time his eyes closed, he saw the cafeteria again. The shank, the blood, the cold, amused smirk on Malik's face as Vargas stabbed him twice without hesitation. The warning. Next time, we go for the throat. Now, Harper sat upright in the infirmary bed, his arms wrapped around his ribs, trying to steady his breathing. The door buzzed open. A guard stepped in. Time's up, Harper. Harper's stomach twisted. What do you mean? He asked, his voice hoarse. The guard smirked. You think you get special treatment? You're going back to the block. Harper's heart pounded. No, he blurted. I'm not ready. I need more time to recover. The guard chuckled. Not how this works, cop. 2 more guards entered, grabbing Harper by the arms. He struggled, but the pain in his ribs made it impossible to fight back. They hauled him out of the infirmary and back into hell. The cell block was louder than usual. Harper's skin crawled as dozens of inmates turned to watch him being dragged back. Some smirked. Others whispered. A few just stared, their expressions hungry. Hungry for revenge. The guards threw Harper into his cell, slamming the door behind him. He barely had time to catch his breath before a shadow appeared in the doorway. Malik Carter. Harper's body went rigid. Malik leaned against the bars, watching him for a long moment. Then, he held up his hand. Between his fingers was another note. Harper swallowed. What now? Malik grinned. Open it and see. Harper's fingers trembled as he took the paper and unfolded it. For words. Tonight. No guards. Just us. His blood ran cold. Malik patted the bars and chuckled. Better get some rest, officer. Gonna be a long night. Then, he walked away. Harper sat back, the note clutched in his hand, his pulse pounding in his ears. Tonight. No guards. Just Malik. And whoever he was bringing with him. Harper's breath turned ragged. Because for the first time since entering Redwood Federal Penitentiary, he was completely certain, tonight, he was going to die. The hours crawled by. Harper sat in the corner of his cell, every muscle tense, his mind spiraling. No guards. Malik had arranged it, which meant whatever was going to happen tonight, no one would stop it. A sharp buzz filled the air. Then, his cell door slid open. Harper's stomach dropped. Footsteps echoed down the corridor. Shadows moved toward him. Then, Malik Carter stepped inside, followed by 5 other inmates, each one bigger than the last, each one grinning, each one ready. Harper's throat tightened. This was it. There was no way out, no escape, no one coming to save him. Malik took a slow step forward, his smirk widening. You ready, officer? Harper pressed his back against the wall, his pulse racing. Malik chuckled. Don't worry, he said. This won't be quick. Then, the first punch landed, and everything went dark. Pain. That was the first thing Harper felt. A sharp, blinding pain that crashed over him like a tidal wave. His head throbbed. His ribs screamed in agony. His vision flickered, dark spots clouding his sight. The world around him was a blur of shadows and voices. Laughter. Low. Amused. Cruel. Somewhere in the darkness, a boot slammed into his stomach. Harper gasped, his body jerking from the impact. Not so tough now, huh? Someone sneered. Another punch connected with his jaw, sending his head snapping sideways. His ears rang. His body slumped against the cold concrete. Somewhere through the haze, he could hear Malik Carter's voice. Calm. Steady. This is what happens, Malik murmured, crouching beside him. This is what happens when you spend your whole life tearing people down. Harper couldn't move. His arms felt like dead weight. His legs refused to respond. His breath was coming in short, ragged gasps. Malik's face came into focus, his expression unreadable. You thought you were untouchable, Malik said. You thought your badge made you a king. He leaned in closer. But now, Malik's voice dropped to a whisper. Now you're just another nobody. Harper's chest tightened. He had never felt fear like this before. The kind that settles into your bones, that digs deep and refuses to let go. The kind that tells you this is it, that you don't make it out of this. One of the other inmates cracked his knuckles. "What do you want to do with him, Malik?" Harper forced his swollen eyes open. Malik tilted his head. "I could end it right now," he mused. "Right here. Right now." Harper's breath hitched. Malik smirked. "But that would be too easy." Harper barely processed the words before. A fist crashed against the side of his head. Then, everything went black. Harper woke up in solitary confinement. He didn't know how long he had been unconscious. Hours? Days? His body felt broken. His face was swollen. His ribs felt like they were on fire. His wrists were bruised from trying to fight back. But worst of all, he was alone. The walls around him were gray, lifeless. No windows. No clocks. Nothing. Just silence. Just emptiness. He wasn't dead. But maybe that was worse. The guards must have found him, pulled him from that cell before Malik and his men could finish the job. But why? Why save him? Harper swallowed, his throat dry. Then, a voice. Deep. Familiar. "General Nathaniel Carter. I told you this would happen." Harper turned his head slightly. Carter stood outside the small barred window of the solitary cell, his arms crossed, his expression cold. Harper's heart pounded. "You don't belong here," he rasped, his voice barely above a whisper. Carter exhaled. "You still don't get it, do you?" Harper clenched his jaw. Carter leaned against the doorframe, his dark eyes unreadable. "This is where men like you end up," he said. "Not because the system failed you, but because you failed yourself." Harper's fists clenched. Carter continued, his voice razor-sharp. "You had power. You had authority. You had every chance to do the right thing. And you chose to abuse it." Harper wanted to argue, to fight back. But he had nothing left. Nothing to hold on to. Nothing to defend himself with. Because Carter was right. Harper had made his choices. And this hell, this prison, this life sentence was the price he had to pay. Carter straightened. "You're gonna rot in here, Harper?" Harper's throat tightened. Carter's expression never changed. And then he turned and walked away, leaving Harper alone, trapped, forgotten, forever. 1 week later, the headlines were everywhere. Ex-police Sergeant Douglas Harper attacked in prison, placed in solitary confinement. Harper to remain in maximum security for his own protection. No possibility of parole. Former officer to spend life behind bars. The world moved on. People stopped talking about him, stopped caring. The prison doors closed behind him, sealing him away from the world forever. And in the darkness of his cell, Harper finally understood. There was no escape, no redemption, no way out. He had destroyed so many lives. And now, his own life was over. The badge that had once protected him was gone. His authority was gone. And all that remained was a man who would die forgotten.